Good week, and welcome to yet another weekly wrap from Ransford. As usual, we'll cover events that happened this week that are likely to affect your investment decisions going forward. The couple stories we'll cover this week is the ECB's rate decision, as well as the South African growth rate. And in fact, we're going to go in depth into the South African economy in this particular presentation, and I'm going to talk about what my views are on the South African economy going forward, what its weaknesses are, what its strengths are, and what we can expect over the next decade or so. Okay, let's start with the ECB. The ECB raised rates by 0.75%, had to be done. We've seen that the US has been raising rates quite strongly. The ECB has not followed as strongly. And over time, what happens there is that you see the differential in rates means that the returns for being in the dollar are better than the returns for being in the pound, or being in the euro. And that means that people are more incentivized to have dollars than to have euros. More demand for dollars, less demand for euros. Euro gets weaker, dollar gets stronger. Now, why is that a problem? Well, a lot of the stuff in the world is basically denominated in dollars. It's basically one of the base currencies in the world. If the dollar is really, really strong and your currency is weak in comparison, what it does do is it does increase the amount of inflation that you have in your economy. A weak currency means that you import stuff at a higher price. It means that you basically are importing inflation into your economy. It's going to make it more difficult for you to control inflation. And so if you have a situation of inflation like the EU definitely does, their inflation numbers are at least as bad as the US, probably a little worse. And they're also heading in the wrong direction. Where the US may have peaked, the EU is still on a rising rates cycle, rising inflation path at the moment. If you don't raise rates to at least kind of match what the US is doing, you're going to make your life a lot more difficult as a central banker. So the ECB had to raise rates, and that's what we've seen come through. 0.75, there was discussion between 0.5, 0.75, but quite frankly, I think 0.75 was necessary, especially given the amount of moves that the US has been doing. At the moment, the euro is at basically parity, to the dollar. It usually is much stronger than the dollar, significantly stronger than the dollar. And the fact that it's back at parity means that we are seeing, relative weakness. It must be noted, however, it's not just the euro, the pound. Most countries of the world are weak against the dollar. It's a case of dollar strength rather than, individual currencies' weaknesses that are happening here. Unfortunately, because the US dollar is so important, because the US is such a big economy, even if it's just the US basically getting stronger, but everyone else is kind of staying the same, because of the size of the US, it does make a difference in terms of your inflation forecast. The next thing we had is the South African growth rate came out for the last quarter. Unfortunately, it was negative, slightly negative. We are basically still below where we were before the pandemic. That means the last 2 years plus 2.5 years or so has been not just a scratch, but a loss for the South African economy overall. And that's where we want to be taking off on our deep dive for this week. In this week, I want to talk to you about what the South African economy's problems are, what we can expect going forward, and what possible solutions are going to be, for us. Okay, so what is the main issue in South Africa at the moment? Well, South Africa's growth rate is just too slow. We have a low growth rate compared to where we should be, which causes a whole bunch of problems. Firstly, a low growth rate means that, in fact, our growth rate is lower than our population growth rate. That means the pie that the South African economy grows, say, a certain percentage every year, the amount of people that we have to feed with that pie grows by a larger amount. That means there's a smaller and smaller piece of that pie available to the population to basically live off. So the per capita GDP in South Africa has been declining for the last few years, which is a terrible situation to be in. It's one thing to be like the US and have a declining or stagnant per capita GDP, or Japan or a European country. In South Africa, because of our poverty, it's quite disastrous to have this kind of low GDP number coming through. So we have low growth. What's causing this low growth? Well, there's a number of different factors out there. First, of course, we know about what's happening in the energy sector. If we were to grow, say, 20% a year, or 10% a year, literally our energy grid could not hold that. At least some of the growth that we will have come through will require more energy, more electricity. At the moment, we can barely supply our current needs. If we had to grow faster, it would make it more difficult for us to supply its needs. It would be almost like a hard cap on our possible growth prospects, because if we grow, say, 5 or 6% a year, quite frankly, Eskom couldn't handle it. Okay, so energy is one thing. The next thing is the underutilization of our human capital. South Africa has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Youth unemployment in South Africa is ridiculously high. We have like a third of the people in this country basically unemployed at the moment. If we look at the youth unemployment rate, it's like more than half of the people, according to some definitions, are not employed. They are what's called not in education, not in employment, not in training. Okay, so they basically are out of the workforce. They're not getting educated, they're not getting trained to enter the workforce in the future. They basically are, excluded. Now, if you look at South Africa's Matric results, you see a very terrible thing there. If you just look a little deeper, for the number of people that basically enter grade 1, so basically starting school, only about 60% of them actually end up writing the Matric exam. 40% of them disappear before they even write the Matric exam. So they're dropping out before that from the schooling system. Of the people that write the Matric exam, majority pass, but because maybe it's only about 60%, we're coming down to about 40% of the people that start grade 1 will in 12 years' time actually go and pass Matric. Now, in South Africa, as everyone knows, Matric is like a minimum that you need to have in your resume to get most jobs. If you don't have Matric, you're basically out of the workforce. Even if you are in the workforce, what's going to happen is that you're going to be relegated to jobs that are not going to be career orientated. You're not going to have the ability to build a career, for instance, as a gardener or something. You're not going to be able to build a real career as a cashier. Why? Because people are not going to let you progress, because most jobs have certain educational requirements, and if you don't even have a Matric, you're not going to get there. In fact, I'd be surprised in certain cases. Some of the largest supermarkets they'd accept you if you have no Matric, even for a cashier job. So we have more than half the population basically wasted. We're talking about 60% of the population basically don't get a Matric, either because they dropped out or they failed, and because we know that the situation for the current the current employment situation in South Africa, to a large extent, these people, even if they are employed, are going to be very significantly underemployed, I would believe, compared to what they could possibly do. So, with regards to the unemployment rate in South Africa, that's a really major issue. And not just because of growth, but also because of the fact that South Africa's, that power we're talking about, gets shifted only towards the employed, mostly towards the upper end of that scale. The instability caused by having a large portion of the population unemployed is quite great. It's been known through history. You have a large population that's unemployed, you're going to have issues, okay? One of the ways the government has got around this is by giving out lots of social grants. Now, because we have such a large number of people that need things and such a small number of people that basically are taxpayers, and the growth rate is quite small as well, the grants are extremely low. I mean, if you were to go look what an old age grant is, it's incredibly low. What a childcare grant is it's almost nothing. But it's important for the people that receive them. What you have to understand is that, again, that's unsustainable. Why? We have such a large number of people on grants in South Africa. It's really a drain on resources, and it means that resources that could be built towards infrastructure and other things that we need, because remember that Eskom is an issue, as well as Transnet, and so is Portnet, and so is all the infrastructure in South Africa at the moment. We have to spend on consumption. But we have to do that because, like I said, if you don't do that, if you have these tens of millions of people unemployed with no source of income coming through, you're going to have some kind of social instability being caused by that. But also in terms of government spending, it's not just on the the grant system out there. What you don't understand, or what we don't understand, is that the public sector is actually a much larger drain of resources than even the welfare state. So government spends more on wages than it does on welfare. And the wage bill in South Africa is also unsustainable. South African public sector workers make more, than private sector counterparts with the same amount of experience and the same amount of qualifications. So if you had a job, in most cases, in the private sector, had you been doing something similar in the public sector, you'd be paid more. In addition, you have better benefits. You have, effectively a tenure. It's very difficult to fire someone in the public sector. Very difficult to retrench someone in the public sector as well. And you have these, benefits like medical aid. You have benefits like, for instance, the pension that comes at the end of it is usually significantly better than what you'd expect to get in the private sector. In most parts of the world, there's a trade-off. If you go to the public sector, you expect to get lower wages but more security. Private sector, higher wages, less security. In South Africa, it's public sector, more wages, better security, better benefits. That is not a sustainable path. So we have government spending going crazy. We have significant unemployment in the population, and we have hard infrastructure caps on our growth rate. What does it mean for South Africa's growth rate going forward? It means it's going to be very difficult to get about 4 or 5%. And 5% is usually considered to be a minimum that we need to have in South Africa to have a real impact in our lifespans, a noticeable impact in lifespans on the unemployment rate, on the poverty rate, on a number of social indicators. Getting to 5% right now, virtually impossible. Why? Just the electricity will stop it, quite frankly. But also, we are wasting massive amounts of human capital. And also, we are digging ourselves in a deeper and deeper government debt hole because the amount of money being spent on wages and the amount of money being spent on welfare. Okay? So, forecast for South Africa in the next 10 years or so. Quite frankly, I don't think we are going to go through a collapse like Sri Lanka did, but that is a danger. Every year that we get to a point where we have a lower GDP per capita, every year that we see more borrowing, where we see government's finances getting worse because we're not basically making as much as we are spending, every year that we add on to the unemployed in this country as more and more young people enter the workforce and don't find jobs, the greater the instability in that economy or in that country. I personally don't think we could have a real breakdown in South Africa in the next 10 years or so, but I do think that the danger does increase over time, number one. Number two, we are likely to see growth rates 1 to 3% around about there. Again, not enough to get us even to a point where we are increasing GDP per capita. So, over the next decade, low growth, increasing chance of instability, okay, and the possibility of a turnaround, I think, is quite unlikely. The political situation in South Africa is going to go through a period of higher fragmentation. There's going to be more political parties out there that have a say in how government is run. When you have a majority like the ANC, they can push through any party line that they want to, any policy that they want to. When you have a dozen or so, maybe 1 or 2 large parties, but a dozen or so parties that are out there with enough votes to basically help a large party basically become, dominant, what's going to happen is you're going to have fragmentation, you're going to have partisanship, you're going to have increased instability in the political sector, which makes it very difficult for me to imagine a situation in which we are going to see growth rates spike up because of better government policy. I think what we're going to see in government policy over the next decade or so is going to be worsening. So, in conclusion, after this pessimistic discussion, I do think South Africa are going through a very bad patch over the next 10 years or so. I'm not saying it's going to be a collapse. I'm not saying it's going to be a disaster like Sri Lanka, for instance. But what I am saying is that expect, to see more economic pain coming through that economy. Expect to see higher levels of instability, okay, and more fluctuation, things like the currency, etc. Okay. On that pessimistic note, thanks for joining me, and I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Cheers.